Okay, yay! Here we are with Kain Warwick, the founder of Synthetix, in the Defiant podcast. Kain, it's so great to have you here. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Kemi. It's I think this is my first podcast of the year.
That's amazing. I was looking back, and you were one of the first people I interviewed for the Defiant, like back in 2019.
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah.
Yeah, I had just started doing interviews. I didn't even have a podcast then. It was just interviews for the newsletter. And you were one of the first to come on. So it's, about time that we had you back. So much has happened since then. And we'll get into all of that, all the latest with Synthetix, your move to Optimism, and all your larger views on the space as well. But to start, I always like to get my guest background and how they got into crypto, what led them to start the project that they're leading. So let's start there. What led you to found Synthetix?
Back in 2014, I started a payment gateway, and the payment gateway wasn't sort of designed to handle crypto alone. It just happened to be a very good use case for it. And so basically what we did is we went and we created this app, this iOS app, and we deployed iPads into, I think at the time, about 700 locations around Australia. And what it allowed people to do is walk into a local retail store and pay cash for things and get that cash converted into some form of digital currency in an app or something like that. And so we worked with a bunch of different people, but one of the immediate use cases that I saw when we started building this out was for the Bitcoin brokerages and exchanges in Australia at the time. So banks were very adversarial back then. They would shut down bank accounts and do all kinds of crazy things to any crypto company back then, most of which were Bitcoin, and they would basically prevent people from taking payments. And so we started rolling this out, I think in 2015 or late 2015, and a bunch of people that I had spoken to previously, like Asher from CoinJar and the Bitcoin.com.au guys, started talking to me about using the service. And so I think we started accepting payments for Bitcoin like early 2016, something like that. And then throughout 2016 and early 2017, it ramped up and volume started, getting bigger and bigger. And I kind of got deeper into crypto and started looking into it more. And I think it was like late 2016, early 2017 that we started to see the premium that people were paying in Australia for Bitcoin increase, right? So, previously they'd have to pay a little bit more, like Korea, right? There aren't huge mining operations in Australia, or certainly there weren't then. And so it would be quite a bit more expensive to buy Bitcoin locally than it was, to buy it, say, in the US or, in a European exchange. And the reason for that is that there just weren't efficient rails to kind of arbitrage, these premiums and get money into Australia and out of Australia, et cetera. And so I started looking into the idea of stablecoins. Obviously, we had Tether back then. That was the dominant stablecoin. This is pre any regulated stablecoins like USDC or TrueUSD. And DAI hadn't launched yet, obviously. And I started looking at the different designs. And my view was, coming from a payment background, that a closed loop payment gateway, something where you actually paid to transact, and those payments went to like a collective pool of people who are, allowing this network to function, would be a more optimal design than, say, charging borrow fees or things like that. It turns out that isn't the case, but that was the initial kind of design for Haven, which was the precursor to Synthetix. And then at the end of 2018, after DAI had launched and all of the regulated stablecoins had launched, we decided to pivot and go into like a wider range of assets, so Bitcoin, ETH, and all the assets we have now.
If you can describe Synthetix just like very briefly for those who are not familiar, like what exactly does it do?
Synthetix is a little bit like Maker in that it allows for someone to put up crypto collateral and borrow against that collateral. And what you borrow is a stable coin that the protocol sort of manages. So in the same way that you put up ETH and you get DAI, or Liquidity, the same thing. You put up ETH and you get DAI. In Synthetix, you mainly stake SNX. You can stake other things like, REN BTC and ETH and a few other things. But mainly, you stake SNX and you get SUSD. So SUSD being the dollar-denominated stablecoin within the network. And that part is pretty similar, right? It's just a crypto collateralized stablecoin. There's liquidation rates and collateralization ratios and all the things you would expect in a crypto collateralized stablecoin. The difference is what we also allow you to do with SUSD is convert that SUSD into any other synthetic asset within the network at this Oracle defined price. So we use Chainlink oracles to say, okay, you've got SUSD. Now you want to buy synthetic Bitcoin. Great. You can buy synthetic Bitcoin. Here's the spot price right now, which is, obviously aggregated from a bunch of exchanges and all over, the crypto economy. And you can convert that SUSD into SBTC. And so basically what happens is the people who are collateralizing this network are now responsible for managing the exposure to all these different assets, right? Because they're the counterparty to these trades. And so it's a little bit more challenging and a little bit more difficult to kind of be a staker within Synthetix than say, something like Maker or Liquidity. But you get the fees from those exchanges. So rather than paying fees to borrow or some other way of generating, revenue for the protocol, it's actually the users of the stable coins of these different synthetic assets that are exchanging between them that generate the fees. So that's kind of the primary difference.
Taking a step back on why something like this might be useful for, people globally. It's this protocol that allows you to mint assets of all kinds in a decentralized way. So what's kind of the bigger picture for Synthetix? Why would this be something that people might want to use?
I think a lot of us, back in the day, had this idea that Synthetix and other things like this, even DAI, would be very useful as a means of payment and a way for people to be able to transact globally. But I think we're still probably a little bit early there. So things like converting AUD into USD or JPY or FX exchanging and things like that. It's just not that much of a use case yet, and I think there's a whole bunch of reasons for that: scaling and transaction costs and all the infrastructure that we need. Most of the use at the moment for most of these things is speculative. And so Synthetix has kind of leaned into this speculative aspect and added much more speculative, volatile assets like Bitcoin and other crypto assets. Also things like commodities, gold, silver, etc. Because the original kind of design of this use case was for people making payments globally, anywhere using Ethereum. But I think again, we're just not quite there yet. So the speculative use case still dominates.
And why would someone want to speculate on Synthetix instead of just going to their local brokerage, for example?
Yeah, so I think the main reasons are that with Synthetix, you have this range of assets that are all on Ethereum that you otherwise might not be able to get that much liquidity into. So especially back when we first started, there was not really a good version of wrapped Bitcoin. And even now we have WBTC, but WBTC is custodial. And so someone who doesn't want, in the same way that you might not want a custodial stablecoin like USDC, you might not want a custodial wrapped version of Bitcoin, right? So you might want a purely synthetic, purely crypto collateralized version. The other advantage is you can go from wrapped, an equivalent wrapped BTC or synthetic BTC into USD, and then into a synthetic version of ETH, and then into a synthetic version of gold. And so you've got this ecosystem of synthetic assets that you can tap into. But I think the other kind of use case is other protocols. So we've seen, for example, with Lyra, which is an options protocol, using Synthetix as a way to hedge their exposure to the options trades that are happening within their options AMM pool. So there are a lot of different things you can do when you've got access to this. You can kind of tap into liquidity instantaneously, and you don't need to go to an AMM or need a pool. Synthetix kind of gives you some of these interesting properties like that.
The theme of the Defiant is embracing our brand and our name, and I'm interested to hear from my guest what they think makes them defiant. We're all in this industry kind of challenging the old guard, the old finance, old Web 2. So, Kain, what do you think makes you defiant?
I think, historically Synthetix has been, and maybe myself driving this, has been a bit of a contrarian. So, if you go back to the, very beginning of the project, like late 2017, when we kind of, emerged from stealth mode, this idea, the implementation that we took, where we had, proxy contracts, for example, right? And a very centralized, centrally controlled protocol was really not very acceptable to the community. This idea of like progressive decentralization, like we were one of the first protocols to really lean into like upgradable contracts and things like that. And so I think, we believed at the time that this was the optimal pathway. And we got, a lot of criticism for that. It was really interesting to see, obviously the industry's changed, and maybe, the pendulum swung too far towards, centralized control of these protocols. But we've never kind of shied away from doing something that was contrarian or doing something that was, not really acceptable, even within the crypto ecosystem, if we thought that was the optimal path. I've always tried to look at each problem on its own merits and say, okay, what is the optimal solution to this problem, regardless of what the consensus is in the community about what you should or, can do.
That's so interesting. And so I'm sure if founders and teams who are building something from scratch in crypto have at some point or another had to deal with this sort of criticism, which the community is really not shy of voicing. So what have you learned from that? Like how to get over the FUD? And I guess like internal FUD is a lot more something to be kind of wary about. It's like your own community is telling you that they don't like your direction. How do you kind of overcome that, or like what's the balance of listening to your community but also like following your own vision as a founder?
I think you have to have high conviction, right, in the space. If you don't have conviction in the space, you're just going to have a terrible time. Now, at the same time, if you are overly convicted and not open to, changing your mind based on new evidence, you're also going to have a terrible time, right? So it's a very kind of narrow path to navigate, where you need to be high conviction, but also very open to new ideas and new concepts. And so I think that's something that you just kind of hone over time, right? And regardless of what you do, there are going to be people that come in and are, we have a FUD channel in Synthetix, right? You can go into our Discord and there's literally people like coming up with like interesting ways of like FUDding the project. You just have to lean into that sort of stuff, right? And say, well, it's going to happen. You can't hide away from it. I'm in there. I respond to people, and sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's dumb. It is what it is, right? But I do think that if you don't have conviction around what you're doing and you don't, really deeply think about what the specific challenges are that you're trying to solve and the solutions you're looking for, then you can just get kind of blown around by, whatever, kind of sentiment is in crypto Twitter or on Reddit or whatever on a daily basis.
I want to go back to what you mentioned about progressive decentralization. I'd love for you to just talk about that process of transitioning to a more centralized app, to a more decentralized protocol. And I'm also interested to hear your thoughts on whether you still believe that's the best approach.
I think back when we started Synthetix, in order for us to do, or Haven, I should say, in 2017, when we started implementing the contracts, even the idea of using proxy contracts was really like, it was not a thing, right? So proxy contracts are something that allows you to deploy a contract and then make a change behind it. And, you can change any of the logic, right? You can just replace the logic, right? And so back then, the idea was you would propose some concept, right? And maybe probably Augur is the best idea, right? You'd say, we're going to build a prediction market, right? And then you go and lock yourself in a room for 2 years or 3 years, and then you would come out and be like, here you go. Here's our perfectly designed thing, and you would implement it, and it would be immutable code, and that would be it, right? And in most cases, that didn't work out very well, right? Uniswap's probably one of the few counterexamples of like deploying immutable code that ended up getting product market fit. And even with Uniswap now, we've got 3 iterations of those contracts, but each one was immutable and then was replaced by a new factory contract. So that was just not seen as an acceptable thing to do, to have these upgradable systems, particularly when the upgrades were managed by a centralized team, right? And so, the criticism that we got was very, very, strong. By the time we started to get to a point where people actually cared what we were doing, they were kind of shocked. They would find out that, the system was upgradable, and they couldn't believe it. If you go back and look at, like early 2018 comments on Reddit or whatever, like some of them are pretty scathing. And so we got to this point though, where I think we were able to kind of demonstrate that this was a workable approach. But that was back in 2018 when we didn't really have much tooling. Even Gnosis Safe that we use today, and a lot of the multi-sigs in DeFi are controlled by Gnosis Safe, right? Which is not optimal, but it's certainly better than it was back then. The old version of Gnosis Safe, you wouldn't be able to even, run some of these complex transactions that are now implemented. So the tooling just wasn't there. So you kind of had to have some central control in order to have upgradability. And we genuinely believed upgradability was the right thing. Today, I think we're in a different situation. I don't think you need to launch with, a foundation or a not-for-profit and a centralized team and centralized control. I think you can do a DAO first launch and come out of the gate very decentralized. On different dimensions, you can choose which dimensions make sense. But a lot of the projects that I work with today, I say to them, you don't need to do all of that stuff. The first, 18 months that Synthetix existed, where, it was a not-for-profit foundation that was centrally managed, had employees, all that stuff. Get rid of all of that. Start from, I think for us, it was like 1 July 2020 or something like that, when, we got rid of the foundation and we were a pure DAO. That's the optimal approach today. But you just couldn't do that back then.
That's so interesting, because you're right. Like the OG DeFi protocols, like Synthetix, Maker, it like the model was this kind of Switzerland-based foundation, which would control the open source protocol and have like different degrees of control over the smart contracts. And you're saying that, I mean, for Synthetix, this was the model, but you're saying that today that's not necessary, just because of how the space and infrastructure has evolved.
Yeah, you just, first of all, I think the idea of having a foundation in Switzerland is just dumb. It's a dumb idea. But it's an idea that, was kind of propagated from a few people being successful. And one of the things in crypto, because there are so many unknowns and it's such, an imperfect information environment, you end up with people just kind of forcing you to do things that were already done, because it's a bit of a, at least that's a known thing, right? Like, oh, the Ethereum Foundation had, is domiciled in Switzerland. Okay, do that thing. At least we don't have to worry about that aspect, right? Let's just copy that. And so I think that there is a lot of that. And whenever you go against the grain and say, actually, no, we're not going to do that, we're going to do something else, there's a lot of pushback in the space. But, the idea of a foundation that is kind of centrally managed, or any entity, right? Whether it's, a for-profit company, like a labs style company, I think is a bad idea. And I think that we are slowly moving away from that. But I think most of the new projects that are launching, have the ability and should be considering just launching as a DAO immediately. And not domiciling anywhere, and not setting up foundations, not setting up for-profit companies, just, go and launch a DAO. It's possible to do.
You're right, because that's the other model, like Uniswap Labs, Compound Labs, they have just like traditional companies, and then that's kind of separate from the protocol itself. But yeah, I guess like the tooling is there, and that's definitely what I also think is the next wave. But I can see how that's scary for a founder to just like go out there and have like this DAO and like not follow the traditional steps of, even for like fundraising and going to VCs. Like or maybe that's out the window too. Like maybe like Web3 and DeFi protocols just like shouldn't be fundraising via VCs, or like what's your take there?
I think we've kind of come full circle on this a little bit. We started with kind of crowd sales, right? Like, the Ethereum crowd sale was just this open crowd sale, right? And, Mastercoin and some of the previous ICOs were just very open public sales. There was no pre-seed and seed and all that sort of stuff. They just kind of went out and said, okay, give us some Bitcoin and we'll launch, right? And I think that then there was a lot of pressure over time, between, late 2014 all the way through to, 2016, from a regulatory perspective, and a lot of sort of regulatory uncertainty. And you got, progressively more and more of these raises were done privately, right? And, done through VCs or angels or whatever. And I think that model has kind of stuck around today, right? It's been hard to kind of unseat that model. The idea of doing a DAO first raise on chain with no entities, et cetera, is a scary prospect, I think, for most founders, right? Because it does go against, a couple of trends that I think have existed for now, 4 or 5 years, right? And so it's not an easy thing to do, even if it is the right thing to do. But this is where I come back to my point about high conviction. If you look at all of the information that you have as a founder today and you're about to launch something, my view is if you have the conviction that you're going to do the optimal thing, you're going to solve the problem in the optimal way, it's pretty obvious that that solution is just, some kind of on-chain raise, right? Directly as a crowd sale. So I think, we started with crowd sales that were only open, no pre-seeds and seed and Series A and all this sort of stuff. And I think we've kind of come full circle where we're almost at a point now where we can go back to that model. But it's still a challenge. There's still regulatory uncertainty. There's all kinds of issues with it, but it is the optimal solution.
Oh, that's so interesting. And then that on-chain raise can be from just like individuals buying your token, and it can also be via DAO funds, right? Like we've seen this model emerging where instead of traditional venture funds, you have just DAOs who are investing in different projects. So that can kind of start to replace traditional fundraising in a way that's kind of more DeFi native.
Absolutely. And, I think we've seen that with the amount of capital that's in the space, most of the people allocating capital are now much more open to a direct DAO capital raise, right? I think almost all of the VCs and angels in the space have participated in some kind of direct DAO, raise. So I think that concept is becoming, again, more palatable, right? People are participating in these capital formation DAOs. You also have things like Alan and some of the launch pads, like the DeFi launch pad. So Alan's my side project where you can go and get a pool of funds basically from a bunch of people, and then have the ability to put that into a specific deal. So you raise, one pool of funds, you put it into a specific deal. So, a seed round, for example, for a DAO, and then that could be potentially your only raise. And then the next thing you do is like an LBP or some kind of, price discovery event. But again, that's on chain. So you can have, from DAO generation all the way through, every single, component of your capital formation be totally open and permissionless. Now, from a regulatory perspective, there's still a lot of uncertainty there. But I think, again, that if you're looking at how to solve this problem in an optimal fashion, that's still the way to go.
And so does this mean that like every project should have a token? To do that, I mean, they would need to, right?
I don't think every project should have a token. I think there are some things that are infrastructure plays, for example, where it may not make sense to have a token. Most of the things that are coordination mechanisms for like on-chain activity of some kind, right, should have a token, because tokens are the optimal coordination mechanism in my mind, right? If you have a token, you can create a set of rules. You can ensure that, the people who abide by those rules are rewarded either through tokens or through some other mechanism. But without a token, that's challenging to implement. And I think that there's also just a component as well of without a token, attention is very scarce in this space, right? And so competing against projects that have tokens with no token, regardless of your view of the value of tokens, is very difficult. So you're almost forced into a situation where you need to design some kind of tokenization of a protocol. But I don't think in every case that's necessary. I think that there are some centralized things. If you're running Infura, should Infura have a token? I don't think so. Will Infura have a token? I don't know, but it probably shouldn't.
I want to speak about your views on the tokens themselves, because at first, tokens were utility tokens. It was that concept of something that you use within the protocol and you use it to pay for different services, and that's evolved into now the token is really something that a means to have governance and have a say on how things are run. And more sophisticated things it's a way to kind of incentivize assets and for users to kind of stay logged in the protocol in some way. So there's been an evolution of how tokens are used within DeFi. What's your take now? How do you think tokens should be used?
I mean, utility tokens Swiss foundations are one of the other dumb crypto memes that I think, probably should have been done away with a long time ago. And I think utility tokens are pretty much dead, right? I think almost everyone knows that utility token, where it's some payment shit that floats around an ecosystem and you use, is just, I think someone coined the term friction tokens at some point, right? And it's very true. Back in the day, though, the reason why people were, pitching these utility tokens, right, that were going to be this little payment method that would float around in their ecosystem, was, in my view, purely from a regulatory perspective, right? They were genuinely concerned about what the implications would be from a regulator if this token were to accrue any value, right? So you had all of these roundabout methods of having value accrual to a token without actually accruing value to it, right, directly. I paying revenue or whatever, or paying protocol fees to token holders. So you'd have buybacks and burns and deflationary economics and all kinds of things. Payment fee burns, et cetera, et cetera. All of these weird things that were devised in 2016, 2017 to get around this. And I think this was one of the things that Synthetix sort of made more acceptable as well, is we just said, that's dumb. That is a dumb way to do things. And actually what Synthetix will do, or what Haven will do, Haven, if you hold it and you stake it, will accrue the fees from within the network. When people pay transaction fees, those fees will be paid to token holders. The end, right? That's how you actually create something that is self-sustaining. And I think that was at the time, pretty shocking to people, right? They genuinely were surprised by this. These days, it's not surprising at all, right? There's tons of examples of things where not just people who are doing some action. So, Uniswap LPs accrue fees, great, okay, but actually examples like Curve, right, where the token holders themselves accrue transaction fees and from the protocol. There's more and more examples of this where the actual protocol fees being paid to token holders. But back then that was not a common theme at all. So I do think that's something that has changed for the better. Obviously then Compound came out with this, valueless, kind of governance token meme as well. Between Compound and Yearn, I think were kind of the two that really drove that meme. And that is interesting again. But, if you look at even the Compound launch, if you go back to that launch, the immediate question that everyone asked of Compound and Robert was, when will fees start accruing to this token, right? Okay, great, we can vote on things, but when do people actually start to earn protocol fees? And then there was this question of, okay, well, the governance will decide when we turn on fees and how much to charge and all of that sort of stuff. So again, all of these things kind of took time to play out, but back in the day, it was a bit of a scary prospect to go against the grain. And so, utility tokens was kind of the dominant meme, but I think it's been replaced by governance tokens and tokens that accrue value, which is obviously much more sustainable.
The way these things are structured does seem like regulatory arbitrage, right? Because in the end, what's happening is that what the token really is a way to represent ownership of a protocol, and that looks a lot like a share in a company, right? So I think, like, in the end, yes, you're like leaving that decision to the community. So it's not centralized. Like, it's not like the management team making that decision of having revenue go to token holders. And you're decentralizing that decision. But in the end, that's what what this new evolution of tokens looks more like. Like, they look more like shares in companies, albeit like a decentralized organization and not a company. And also, like, the other difference is that it's kind of the token holders themselves, the ones who vote on this happening, and it wasn't like a centralized decision. But it is starting to look a lot more like stock.
I think, you really need regulatory arbitrage when you start from a point where you've got an attack vector for regulators, right? So if you start with a Swiss foundation or, a not-for-profit foundation domiciled in Singapore or Australia or something like that, or the UK or whatever, if you start from that point, or you start with like a lab style approach where you've got, a for-profit company that develops the protocol, but it's, somehow supposed to be separate from that protocol and not involved. If those are your starting points, then regulatory arbitrage is critical, right? If your starting point is this is a DAO from day one, right? It's launched as an open protocol. Anyone can participate. Yes, there are engineers contributing. And yes, there's people that are designing things. Yes, there's people that are, doing comms within the community and providing liquidity and, providing market making. But all of these people are kind of coming together to create this protocol based on some design. And, this is how we did ALAN, right? I wrote a spec for a thing based on a dumb thread that Mariano and I started, like 9 months ago or whatever. And I said, this is a spec for a protocol. It could work, right? And I put it out there and, a bunch of people came together and said, this is really cool. We want to build it, started building it. And then everyone got together and did, kind of this fair launch of a token where it was distributed to SNX holders who kind of helped with the governance, bootstrapping. And then, there's liquidity farming and all kinds of stuff. But it was like there was never a centralized entity at all in the entire evolution of it, right? So, ALAN doesn't have to worry about, I think, regulatory attacks in the same way that Synthetix did when there was this, not-for-profit foundation in Australia that was, had directors and all of the kind of normal infrastructure you have for companies.
So now if you're starting directly from a DAO, you don't need to go through all those hoops, and you can just directly say,
just do the optimal thing.
Yeah, just like our token is going to be staked and token holders will get a percentage of protocol revenue, and that's it.
Yeah. And I think, Yearn is probably the best example of this, right? Because Andre just launched it out, wrote some code and just said, see you later, right? There was never, and like Yearn paid the price for this, right? Like, let's not, it's amazing now. And I think, you can look at it and say, like, was that actually, did it need to go through that, trough of disillusionment and pain and suffering that everyone, went through when it was hard to coordinate this thing? But did it emerge on the other side, far stronger for it? Yes. Right. Now, could you find a way to like avoid that, little dip of pain? I don't know. Right. But what I do know is that when you come out the other side of something like that, when you've had this very open and kind of chaotic formation process, if you do emerge on the other side, you are in a far, far better situation. And I think Yearn is probably better positioned than almost any protocol that, large scale protocol, at least, in the ecosystem because of that process of how, what the genesis of Yearn was.
I want to go back to the Synthetix story. So we were talking about progressive decentralization and how that to you is not necessary now. And I just want to chat about your kind of leaving and then coming back to Synthetix. And I'd love to get some kind of color on why that decision was made, that you felt you had to come back.
Yeah, like the Kain abandoning Synthetix meme, I think has kind of taken on a bit of a life of its own. It's not the most accurate thing, and I think I tweeted about this a little while ago. I said, like, I have a habit of being overly transparent sometimes, right? That's just the way that I am. I'll kind of throw things out there, and I'm fairly open about what I think and how I think and what's going on. And so the blog post that I wrote about it was a dumb joke, right? Like an old dictator appears. Like it was this like dumb meme as well. And I like to, make dumb memes and shit post. But I think what it did is it created in people's mind this idea that like I had left, and I didn't really leave. What happened was I took a step back from day-to-day sort of governance decisions, right? So we had set up this new governance structure, which was really untested, right? This idea of like, now there's a bunch of people who are doing this, but the idea of having like a delegated democracy where there's a council of people that's voted in by token holders, and those people can make decisions on behalf of their sort of constituents was not a common thing. It's starting to become a bit more common now. I think it will become even more common, over the next couple of years. But really, you kind of had either direct token holder voting, or you had pure delegation to people voting on individual issues, right? But it wasn't like this, council that was elected for an epoch of some length, and they had discretion to kind of make decisions and discuss things, and and weigh all the information and then make decisions on behalf of token holders. That was a very different model, and we didn't know how it was going to go. The first month or so of it was very chaotic because I had this really stupid idea of like, let's do a liquid democracy so that people could, be removed at any moment if, people, if their token holders decided they didn't like the direction they were going, right? It was a check on power effectively, but it just ended up in pure chaos because the composition of the council would like change on an hourly basis sometimes, and no one knew who was in the council, who was deciding things. And so it's like a very nice thing in theory, but in practice it was just utter nonsense, and it just didn't work, right? And so that was the first month of this council, which was like earlier last year. And so I think I wanted to give that space, right? I wasn't on the council. I wanted to give the council a chance to kind of really step in and start to kind of take control of things. And so I stepped back. And as I stepped back from, that kind of frontline discussion and decision making, I sort of lost touch with some aspects of the protocol. But like at the absolute, low point of how engaged and involved I was still doing like 20, 25 hours a week of work on Synthetix, right? So it wasn't like I was still having conversations. I was on weekly, product calls. Like it wasn't like I just disappeared and, went to Thailand for 6 months or something like that and was uncontactable. As nice as that sounds sometimes. Nice. But what it did do is it created some chaos within the core contributors, right? At the time, I think we had about 20 core contributors, and me stepping back and not kind of, pushing an agenda and creating, this narrative of what we were doing, meant that, these people were spread all around the world. Most of them hadn't ever met each other. They were just sort of looking around going like, who is leading this thing? Right? Because, the council wasn't in a position to lead yet. Right. And so what you had was this leadership crisis. And so when I came back, it was really to kind of help put some leadership around the core contributors. The protocol itself didn't need leadership. I think the protocol was fine. The core contributors, the people who were building and doing things on a day-to-day basis, needed leadership. And I think we've now gotten to a point where that leadership is starting to form. We've got some senior, core contributors who have formed this kind of core contributor committee. They help with, all kinds of coordination things within the core contributors. And so it's less of a problem today than it was, a year or so ago.
Got it. So are you still kind of in that leadership position right now?
So what happened was I basically said, I'm going to run for the council, right? So I think in the epoch that started on the 1st of July, I said, we need someone who is going to be sort of a gateway between the core contributors and the council, right? So I'm going to run for the council. I'll be one of 8 people. I still don't have control, right? But I felt like after 6 months, the council had kind of proven that it was a workable model, right? And it wasn't going to be as much of an issue if I was involved with it. And, I'm very opinionated. I have, strong views. There are token holders who were kind of pushing me in the background to be on the council. They said, they wanted, they wanted to see me kind of, step in. Obviously, I'm still one of the largest token holders. So, I had a view that I could, make sure that my own interests were managed within the council, but it's still one of 8 votes, right? And so I'm still on the council. I've still been on the council continuously since then. And what that's meant is that I've had a view into, governance decisions, as well as some of the considerations around prioritization and, engineering challenges and, optimization and all of the kind of background things that have been going on, which I think helps. There are other, contributors who are, there's 2 other contributors who are on the council as well. So they kind of help with that process. But it's a very kind of fluid and amorphous structure still. But I think we're getting closer to something that's workable long term.
What's missing? Just like more structure?
I think still more structure, right? And processes and procedures. Even to this day, we'll still be proposing. There was an issue that happened. I had to propose an SIP. I didn't have to, but I thought this was the right approach. We proposed this SIP that said, if there's a bug, if a critical vulnerability is found, we need a way of bypassing some of our processes and procedures, right? So we have a process whereby every SIP needs to be presented to the entire community. You need at least 5 of the council members to be present. It needs to be recorded. There needs to be a public record of like why this decision was made. And so there are examples when engineers come to the council and say, hey, there's a bug, we need to fix it, right? There's some disclosure from a white hat or something like that. And we didn't have a process to bypass this, this kind of committee and presentation. So I wrote a SIP and said, if all 8 of the council members are in agreement, right? If you have unanimous consensus that this thing needs to be done, you can bypass that. That's a process that just didn't exist. And it needs people that are sort of very I'm the type of person who I just get into the details, right? Like I care about the details a lot. And so you need to be very kind of diligent and mindful of what's going on and seeing where there are inefficiencies and trying to solve it. And it's just one of the roles that I play.
It's really interesting. So through this conversation, we've gone through different kind of mechanisms or innovations from Synthetix that really kind of preceded a lot of the ways that things are done right now. Like using the native token for staking, like using delegates for governance, like all of these things. Synthetix was pretty early in implementing. And liquidity mining was also one of these things that Synthetix was really early. So I don't think a lot of people realize this thing that's taken off and that's really, I think, moving a lot of liquidity in DeFi today, just like token incentives, liquidity mining, yield farms, all of that. I think it started with Synthetix, right?
Yeah.
So I love that to go through kind of what the thinking was that led to that decision to start doing token incentives.
So I think that there are 2 aspects of yield farming, right, or liquidity mining. One is internal incentives within the protocol. So how do you bootstrap the protocol itself, right? And then the other is external liquidity. And we kind of did both of them around about the same time, but I think people remember the yield farming of within Uniswap more, right? So we had this issue where we needed an on-ramp into the Synthetix ecosystem. You have this cool property where once you're in SUSD or once you're in SBTC, you can kind of bounce around between all these different synths really easily. It's very low friction. It's a cool thing. getting into that ecosystem was hard. There was very little liquidity in and out. And so after Uniswap had launched, and it was starting to get traction, we were like, okay, this is really cool. Like, how can we leverage this? And so we decided to build this synthetic ETH pool that would be really, have a lot of depth. And we're like, well, we'll just pay SNX tokens, right, for people to put liquidity into this thing, right? And it went from I think like the 50th or something largest pool to the largest pool by like, an order of magnitude or something like that over the course of like 2 or 3 months. And all of a sudden people were like, whoa, like, there was this idea that like liquidity was like sticky. It was hard to move, people, there was a lot of friction for people to move that, it was nonsense, right? Like you could literally, by the time we got to like DeFi summer, you could like click your fingers and have like $1 billion worth of TVL, right? And so I think that what we proved is that liquidity, it was very mercenary, and that people would move around very quickly, that they were on top of this, and that markets were actually much more efficient than people assumed in terms of like liquidity provisioning and what have you. And it also was, I think one of the big drivers for an early use case of Uniswap, which was like price discovery and all the things that kind of came later. So it was definitely one of those early experiments that worked out very well for us.
Liquidity being really mercenary, what can projects do to just like get people to stick around? Like what have you learned from that so far?
So I think the other side, the other facet of this was like bootstrapping Synthetix itself, right? So we felt like we suddenly had this thing, in early 2019 where people were interested in synthetic Bitcoin. There was no way to get Bitcoin exposure on Ethereum back then. I mean, there were a couple of ways, but they weren't very good, right? And so, getting synthetic Bitcoin exposure on Ethereum was really cool. It was a use case where people were like, okay, cool. Now wrapped Bitcoin, has billions of dollars worth of TVL, but back then that wasn't the case. So we felt like we had something that people were interested in, but we still couldn't really get people to stake, right? We couldn't get this flywheel going. And so when we changed the monetary policy and said, we're going to go from this fixed supply of 100 million tokens, which is another dumb meme, right? I think you can go back to the ERC20 standard, right, to talk about that, because in the token standard it says how many tokens do you want, and you just put a number in, and that's the end, right? And now you have that many tokens, whether it's 50 or 50 billion. So the idea of having like a fixed supply of tokens and they're all emitted, at Genesis, and then that's it, I think was not very useful. Now what you have oftentimes is people will create a certain amount of tokens and they'll hold some in a DAO treasury and they're paid out as incentives over time. But Synthetix is actually different. Like we genuinely changed the monetary policy where there are more tokens every week. Like there's actual inflation. Like the total supply of tokens on the contract changes on a weekly basis. It goes up, right? It's something that people, I don't think, even necessarily realize. Like you can still work out what the total supply of tokens will be, at the end, and then there's like terminal inflation, but like it's not a standard ERC20 token in that sense. And so we worked out a way by paying incentives to people to stake the token to get that flywheel going and get people to actually learn how to stake, why you stake, what the benefits are, etc. And I think that was one of the big drivers of adoption. And I think that that's something that a lot of protocols have now subsequently used to say, okay, well, we'll pay out our own tokens to get you to do the internal function, not just liquidity provisioning externally in Sushi or Balancer or Uniswap or whatever, but also internally. But I still think it's an underutilized mechanism. I think there's more opportunity to use it than it's being used right now.
Really? I feel like it's being used so much.
So again, like the liquidity provisioning externally, I think is overused, right? The idea of like pool twos and creating as much liquidity or whatever, paying out tokens to your users or to the people who are providing the service that you need internally. I think there's still a lot more, like it's one of those things where like people are doing it, but they're just doing it the same dumb way over and over, right? Like there's a larger design space, right? Like people haven't explored it as much as they could. And I think that there's still room for experimentation there.
So interesting. Okay, want to move on to Optimism, because you were first on many things. We're also first on moving to Optimism. So What's that experience been like, and why did you choose this specific scaling platform?
I think one thing that comes to mind as you say that is maybe being first to everything is not not the best thing ever, and I think this is a very good example of that. I have I think multiple sort of allegiances here, right? Like I'm aligned to Synthetix specifically. I'm a token holder. I'm aligned to Ethereum more generally because I believe that the Ethereum ecosystem is the most likely ecosystem to kind of survive and get through to this next phase, right? And then I'm aligned to like crypto more generally, right? Like even if Ethereum isn't the optimal solution, if it's something else, I believe that what crypto is doing and generally what's driving this is something that is going to transform society in a very positive way, right? So I've got these different layers, right? So pushing Synthetix, which we had to do. We didn't have an option, right? Like it wasn't like we were like, oh, let's go and do Optimism because it'll be really good for Ethereum, right? It was like Synthetix needs a scaling solution here. We had a whole bunch of issues that we were facing around latency and oracles and transaction costs, and Synthetix transactions have always been very, very expensive. Even back when like it was Gwei was 0.8, right? Like I remember putting in 0.8 Gwei transactions. People would still be like, oh my God, this is like so crazily expensive. Like this transaction cost me like $2, right? And you're like, yeah, look, they're complex contracts. Like that's just the way it goes, right? By the time we got to the peak, like it was costing people, $500 to do a Synthetix transaction. It's just crazy, right? It was just absolutely cost prohibitive. You couldn't, and Synthetix forces you to transact regularly. You got to claim all the time. You got to rebalance your collateral ratio. You can't just dump money in a pool and come back 6 months later, right? You got to be doing things on a constant basis. And so we had to do this. But even if we didn't, I still think that someone had to be the guinea pig, right? Someone had to be the project that was willing to say, roll-ups are the solution. We're going to do this. This is the optimal way of scaling complex smart contracts. Let's go through the pain. And we did, and it was a lot of pain, and it took us, I think yesterday was actually the 1 year anniversary of us being live on Optimism, right? It was a long process of going from live. We still don't have all the contracts, fully deployed on Optimism and transition from L1. There's still legacy contracts on L1. So it's been a painful process, but I think if you ask me, like, would I do it again? Weighing up all of my allegiances that I have personally, like even as a Synthetix token holder, even if you said, well, okay, the price action of SNX has been, which a lot of people are very happy to say has been terrible last year. Everything else went up 100x and SNX, was down 20% or whatever it was, year on year. I still think that I would say as a token holder, I would vote for us to do that. Because if we hadn't have done it, and someone had, and Optimism had waited 6 months to find someone who was willing to do that, we'd still be 6 months out from, getting to this point of scaling. Now, I think we have, we have a situation where we're pretty much ready to scale. The whitelist has been removed from Optimism. There's competitive pressure within the ecosystem. Arbitrage's been, forced to kind of, do a whole bunch of things. We're seeing forks of Optimism and Arbitrage, competing with them. So we've got a much more competitive ecosystem. And I think that just required people to jump in, and say, let's do this, even if that meant a lot of pain in going through that process.
Okay, but why specifically Optimism? Like, why Optimism and not Arbitrum or not like CK rollups or Polygon or like, I don't know, like another. There are like many different options you potentially could have done. So why this one specifically?
So Sidechains, I think we ruled out pretty early. Obviously we talked to the XI team early on, right? And we said, we just don't think that this is a good idea to be, creating these side chains, whether they're application specific or whatever. I think there were a lot of people who were really excited about that early, and I just was never a big fan of it. I think it didn't make that much sense. So even Polygon. Now, in hindsight, if I could do things differently, I would say actually we would put Synthetix on Polygon straight away and just, hold our nose and say it's not optimal, but it's better than waiting, 18 months for optimistic rollups to be ready for production. But, I think in this space where, pardon me, where, we're like, we're very like, no pun intended, we're very optimistic, right? Like we like to think that things will be sort of ready faster than they might be. So, we were hoping that Optimism and optimistic rollups would be ready sooner. So that was the reason why no sidechains. In terms of why Optimism over Arbitrum, we knew the team. We liked their approach. We liked how they were doing things, and we just thought, their approach made sense. And that was kind of it. And then I think the final question of like, why not zero knowledge approaches? So like the zero knowledge rollups are not ready is the answer, right? And if we'd been waiting for zero knowledge rollups, then we'd still be waiting, right? They're still not quite there. Waiting, yeah. Stockware, the challenge is that unlike DYDX, we don't have any off-chain state storage, right? Like all of our state is on chain, and so Stockware just isn't the optimal solution for that. Whereas things like Diversify and DYDX, because they've got these off-chain order matching systems and state management systems, it's much more amenable to that approach. StockNet obviously changes that, but StockNet is still not quite ready for something as complex as Synthetix. So again, we picked the thing we thought was going to be ready sooner. It was not ready as soon as we had hoped, but I still think, today, the position we're in a very good position. I think both Ethereum and Synthetix is in a very good position. We've suffered a lot for it over the last year, but, ultimately, the only thing that we could have done that would have been more optimal, I think, would have been going to Polygon first and trying to run things in parallel while we waited to get Optimism ready to go.
From now, like, how long do you realistically think like all the contracts will be deployed on Optimism and like things will be kind of ready to go and kind of scale from there?
I think we're, I hesitate to make timeline predictions, but I think we're getting very close to like what we call the V2X scope, which was everything up to merging the two networks. Right. So, we've got staking on both networks. We need to merge those two networks so that the synthetic assets are fungible across both Optimism and L1. We're probably on the order of like months away from that process being completed. So once that's completed, that's the end of our V2X scope, right? This is like Ethereum 1X, right, versus Ethereum 2. We split the teams and said, okay, the V3 team that's going and building Synthetix V3, you guys go off. Don't be distracted by, all the fires that are over here in this production system, which is now, 4 years old and has a whole bunch of tech debt. Like go off in a vacuum, work on a new architecture, new implementations of all of these different systems, and we'll give you the space to do it. And we won't pull you back into this, because that was the same thing that happened, with Ethereum, right? It's like these teams were still talking to each other, and you couldn't, until the split happened. I don't think that, the progress was nearly as fast. Once that split happened and all the E2 teams had independence and could kind of go out, I think that's when really progress ramped up, and we saw that process. It's slightly different with Synthetix, but similar idea of like you can't be maintaining a production system and also building the new thing. You've got to have some differentiation. So we did that. So I think the V2X scope is almost done, and then the other piece of scope which is still floating around that hasn't been deployed yet is futures. So, synthetic futures or perpetual futures that will allow people to have leverage, trade, Bitcoin with 5-10x leverage, et cetera, which obviously competes directly with DYDX. That has been ready to be delivered for a long time, but couldn't be delivered until we were on Optimism, just because of latency issues with oracles and things like that. So we needed that scalability. So it's getting close. Again, both of these things are close. I think we're on the order of like, probably a couple of months for both of them. But, I've said that before. So I'm hesitant to put out time predictions, unfortunately.
I totally kind of get you. Like, I've been saying a bunch of things about the Defiant too. Like, oh yeah, it's a couple of weeks, couple of months with our yeah. So anyways, it's how building goes, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what's next will be merging like the current Synthetix protocol, which is on mainnet, to staking, which is now on Optimism.
Yeah, so basically, we've got basically two independent versions of the protocol running, and so we need to merge those two. We need to implement all of the synthetic assets on L2. So at the moment, there's only 3. So we need to transition all the synthetic assets across. We need to make them fungible across both networks. So there's still a couple of things. And then we've had this, and this is, I think, something that's kind of interesting, that it's really hard to kind of, you can sit there and theorize all day, right, about how things are going to play out, why things should be a certain way or whatever. Until you're actually dealing with it empirically, it's really hard, at least for me, right? Like, I find this very hard to reason about what the challenges will be, right? So within optimistic rollups, you have this 7-day challenge period, this withdrawal period, right? And, everyone was like, oh, this is the thing, whatever. I don't think anyone really truly understood the pain of having that within the user experience until they kind of experienced it themselves. I deal with it all the time now because I'm doing stuff on Optimism frequently. You forget to trigger a transaction to withdraw the assets, and you assume that they're on L1, and then you come back and you're like, oh man, now I got to wait another week, right? Like, a week in crypto is a long time, right? And so I think that what we found is that something that seemed like a theoretical annoyance is actually practically very, very challenging. And so what that's meant is that all of the people that have been working this ecosystem have all been faced with this very practical friction point. And all of us independently have started thinking about, like, oh, how can I get around this? Like, that you're a problem solver, right? Like, that's what you do in crypto. You're like, I've got this problem. I keep running into this wall. How do I work around it, right? And so various people within the synthetic ecosystem have been thinking about this over the last probably 3 or 4 months. And kind of independently, we've come up with this idea of you could actually use synths as a fast withdrawal bridge, right? And I tweeted about this the other day. You could create a mechanism whereby there's a relayer that doesn't require multisig. It's a relayer that uses 2 contracts that are both on the different networks, right? And gives you much stronger security. Obviously, you still have this collateralized stablecoin underpinning all of it, right? So there's some there's different security concerns around that mechanism. But in terms of the bridges themselves, they're pretty simple and straightforward, right? It's the mechanism to allow the bridges to exist that's complex, right? And so you could have this situation where synths, SUSD could act as a fast withdrawal bridge once the synths are fungible. And I don't think it really occurred to anyone, A, that this would be such a big problem to the point where we started thinking about solutions to it, or B, until we started actually doing the feasibility to build a synth bridge across there. We didn't really dig into it enough to be like, oh, wait, there's these interesting properties where I could bypass this big problem that I've been dealing with for the last couple of months. And so independently, 2 or 3 of the engineers and myself have all kind of come to this conclusion that actually synths as a fast withdrawal bridge are probably one of the optimal solutions to this problem. So hopefully, once we get through this debt pool merge, in the next month or 2, then we'll be able to start work on these what we call teleporters, right? Which will significantly reduce the friction of dealing with L1 to L2. I think all of us were like, this is a bad thing, but everyone will deal with it. Honestly, I don't think people will deal with it. It's too high friction. It's too painful. It's painful. It's very painful. Yeah.
This is so interesting. So Synthetix might become also a bridge between Optimism and mainnet. And do you think that this will be only for Synthetix users, or maybe anyone could use this bridge?
So it kind of goes back to the point around why we started yield farming with Uniswap, right? Okay, great. You're in the Synthetix ecosystem. Awesome. You have a bunch of synthetic BTC and you want to get back onto L1. Cool, right? But how does that help the average person, right, who doesn't have a bunch of synths? Well, we actually have a solution to this already on mainnet through Curve, right, which is cross-asset swaps. So we've got a couple of different ways that you can do cross-asset swaps. So you could, in theory, using Curve, or something similar on L1 and L2. You could start with, let's say, Rapid Bitcoin on L2. You could go into synthetic Bitcoin on L2 through Curve, through a shared pool. You could then take that synthetic Bitcoin and use a synth teleporter to instantaneously, or within a few seconds, get onto mainnet as synthetic BTC, and then you could exit that synthetic BTC through another Curve pool back into Wrap BTC with pretty low fees, right? Obviously there's going to be fees there, but you might pay 0.5% or like 50 basis points, 60 basis points, etc. But that 7 days, the time value of money in crypto is extremely high, right? 7 days of sitting there with your wrapped Bitcoin, and especially when you think about volatile assets. And I think, to be honest, this is the thing. And you think later, like, wow, what an idiot I was. Like, how was that not obvious to me? But like the other day, I withdrew a bunch of ETH, right, through the Optimism bridge, and I was like, wait a second, I now have like this weird situation where I've got a bunch of ETH that's like transitioning across, and like I have no, like, the price is moving up and down. And, yeah, it's like, it is a bit scary to like be like, all right, you like put your assets in a little capsule and like send it off and then wait for it to come back on the other side, right? I don't think that's a common thing in crypto to deal with, and so it's just a weird piece of friction that I don't think practically that many people thought through. We knew it was going to be annoying, but it's actually much more than annoying. And so I think this is something that a lot of people are thinking about solutions for. Hop is looking at solving this. Seller, Connects. There's a bunch of people that have been thinking about this for a long time. They knew that this was going to be a problem. Certainly myself, I didn't think it was going to be as much of a problem as it actually is practically for my own use case.
After this is done, then futures like perpetual swaps and
perpetual
so on.
swaps, yeah.
I wanted to touch on just to start wrapping up this like big controversy that there was around one of your statements recently. So you said that people you respect have sold out in pursuit of profit maximization, but they'll come back to Ethereum when layer 2 scaling becomes inevitable. And then Suzu from 3 Hours Cap kind of like took that on. And I'd love to kind of hear like more on this, on not necessarily kind of the spat on Twitter, which is like really snowballed, but just like the initial statement.
Yeah. So, I think I have a view that it's good that Ethereum, the community, takes the high ground in most of these debates, right? Most of the people who are in Ethereum are pretty high conviction, right? Certainly the people who've been around for a long time, right? They're very convicted across a number of different viewpoints, right? They're convicted that like Ethereum is optimal scaling solution, and that we will make the right decisions as a community around how we scale this thing, and we won't take shortcuts or make trade-offs that will have consequences down the road, right? We'll make the hard decisions and we'll deal with the pain of those hard decisions, right? Like we did with Optimism, where we had a year of pain, right, in choosing that path. But now we're in a position where this year everyone's going to forget. Everyone will forget last year, right? Like people in crypto have very short memories, right? So we said, you know what, we'll take that pain for a year as we try and scale this thing. But by next year, the L222 meme, right? We're going to be in a position where everyone's going to be like, oh, this is amazing. And they'll forget that it wasn't like that last year. They'll just go into it. And so I think when you have that high conviction, it's easy to kind of sit back and take the high road and say, we're not going to get dragged into these fights around, what's better or whatever. We'll let people FUD Ethereum and say that, Ethereum doesn't care about users or doesn't care about transaction costs or doesn't care about all of these things that, they've been saying. We also, and there are people in the community that do fight back against this stuff, right? But most don't. Most just say, well, I'm not going to get involved in this bickering and your argumentation on Twitter. I'm just going to go and keep building and doing my thing. The problem with that is that you have so many new people coming into the space, and they see these prominent people taking advantage of Ethereum and taking advantage of the fact that we don't fight back. And, allowing them to make outrageous statements that are, inaccurate or outright lies, right? And there's not really a lot of pushback, because we're like, oh, we're over here building, flowers and rainbows and unicorns and all that sort of stuff, right? Which is amazing. And I love that about the Ethereum community. But like, we also exist in a marketplace. And if we let people take advantage of us, it's going to be a problem. So I think you have this situation in Ethereum where, we might not fight back enough or fight back as much as we should. And my view was that, if you're going to have these people that are willing to criticize and attack Ethereum when it's profitable for them. Our conviction says that we're eventually going to get back to a position where Ethereum is in the ascendancy again, and we kind of take back the narrative once scaling happens, etc. When that happens, these people who are low conviction, who don't really care, who are happy to kind of bounce around and, shill whatever thing is going to, make them the most money at whatever time, are going to obviously come back to Ethereum. And then they're going to be sitting here, pretending like they were Ethereum cheerleaders the whole time. And my point was just that we should be wary of people like that, and we shouldn't allow them to exploit us and take advantage of us. And that's it. And obviously, for someone who is in the process of doing that, that's not something that they like to hear. But that's just the reality.
Just like to clarify the bigger point, it's to you, it's about, you are very highly convinced that Ethereum is going to be, it's the most likely to be the winning layer one for decentralized finance and Web3, and that it's going to scale with layer 2 solutions based on Ethereum layer 1, and that we're on the road to get there. And like as you've said, it's tough right now, but it's like everyone is building towards a period when Ethereum dApps can scale. And in the meantime, what bothers you is investors who have hugely benefited from Ethereum are now cashing out and going to Ethereum competitors in this time when Ethereum is kind of in the process of getting there, of like getting to scaling.
I don't even have so much of an issue with that, right? Like, if someone decides that they don't like Ethereum anymore and they want to go somewhere else, fine. Do whatever works for you, right? My point was actually more about when we inevitably do start scaling, and when Ethereum kind of takes back the narrative, just be aware of who those people were, because they will absolutely come flooding back and be like, hey guys, we're back, isn't Ethereum amazing again? And we need to kind of have longer memories than we do sometimes. So we need to be more protective of the ecosystem. Now, people pushed back on that initial sentiment and said, no, we should welcome people with open arms, whatever. But my view is, like, if people are going to exploit the Ethereum ecosystem, we shouldn't welcome those people with open arms. Like, that's just like not a great way to approach things. Now, maybe that's too exclusionary or whatever. As I said, Ethereum's very like flowers and rainbows and all that sort of stuff. And I love that aspect of Ethereum. But I also think we exist in a market, and I think that we need to be, more protective of Ethereum, especially as the stakes get larger and larger, right? There's a lot of money at stake, and there's a lot of value at stake for people to criticize and attack Ethereum, and we just need to be prepared to defend against that. We have to be.
Do you see any future where there is more than Ethereum, where it's, like a multi-chain future, a cross-chain future? Maybe Ethereum is good for specific use cases, but other chains will be better for other use cases?
I think my view has been for a while that it will be a winner-take-most situation. I think the chain that can credibly scale and maintain decentralization will be the chain that most of the value settles on, right? And so right now, in my view, that is very likely to be Ethereum. But as I kind of said earlier, I've got three allegiances here. Like, there's the Synthetix one, and then, there's the Ethereum one, and then there's the broader crypto one. If Ethereum is not the right solution, and I don't personally believe there's evidence to say that it isn't yet, I still believe very strongly that it is. But if I have evidence to the contrary, I will change my opinion and I'll say, okay, Ethereum, wasn't the optimal solution. There was something else that was better out there. And I'll absolutely, put my weight behind that. But for right now, at least to me, and obviously, I'm an Ethereum OG, so I've, got some bias there. But I still, I believe that hopefully, my track record of changing my mind when the evidence changes is sufficient to for people to believe that I have credibility when it comes to saying that I think Ethereum is the optimal solution right now. Mm-hmm. But I mean, each to their own, I guess. Some people think that that's not credible.
Do you have any investments in other layer ones?
I don't. Back in the day when I was like trading crypto, going back to like 2015, 2016, I definitely had other things. I think I even held some ADA at one point, but not really meaningfully. But these days, really, my focus is on the Ethereum ecosystem. So I don't tend to invest in anything outside of the Ethereum ecosystem.
We've talked about kind of near-term goals and milestones that you're working towards. What's a big term vision? Like, where would you want Synthetix to be 5 years from now? Or I don't know, what's kind of like the end game?
I think that Synthetix is a very novel approach to this idea of creating synthetic assets, right? It's not a solution that many people have tried. They've tried variants of it, but it still remains, even to this day, fairly novel. And so I do think that it's hard to say how that exactly is going to play out. But my hope is that what you have are more protocols that are leveraging Synthetix to build novel things. So Lyra is a great example of that. Even Thales uses, both of these are options protocols that use Synthetix. D-Hedge uses Synthetix. So I think that Synthetix has some very novel properties that make it very good for protocols to compose, to integrate into their own smart contract suites. The challenge with that historically has been that we haven't had atomic transactions on L1 for a really long time. On layer 2, on Optimism, we have atomic transactions, which means that it's much easier for other protocols to integrate Synthetix. So my hope is that over the next 3, 4, 5 years, Synthetix becomes even more deeply embedded in the ecosystem, and more protocols are using it to build novel solutions on top of.
Do you see it competing with DYDX or more with Terra and like Mirror and like UST or both? Like, what direction would you want it to take?
If we go down this path of being kind of very application specific, as in like, synthetic futures, and that is the thing that drives adoption, then I think the community needs to lean into that. And certainly in the near future, as I said earlier, speculation is a big driver of activity. And so in the short term, that may be the optimal path to just keep focusing on that. But what we found is that even while we focus on, the trading experience, there's always people coming in and turning up. Andre is a great example of this. He turns up, he's like, oh, well, could I use Synthetix for this? And we're like, yeah, you could. And we talk it through and work out a way to kind of build these sort of more infrastructure style integrations. And so I think that as much as we're pushing the product focus, my hope is that we will also see a kind of this base layer Synthetix, utility that people can integrate into. So I think they're kind of parallel paths.
This has been an amazing conversation. I'm so grateful for you taking the time and sharing all your views and experience with us. I guess like final question, since this is the second podcast of the year. What are you looking forward to in 2022 for DeFi and Web3?
The point that like layer 2 scaling is actually working. And we're basically there, depending on what your application is, whether it's DYDX on Starkware or, Arbitrage and Optimism. I think we're at a point now where we're seeing layer 2 native protocols being built, and they're doing novel things you just can't do on L1. And so I'm very excited to see people really lean into that experimentation and say, okay, we're going to, start playing around with kind of novel solutions. And I think we're going to see some really interesting stuff built out on Optimism and Arbitrum this year.
Nice. L222, or I don't know how
Exactly.
you say that meme.
Yeah, that's fine. L222. Yeah, that's good.
All right. Well, Kain, thanks again. Amazing having a DeFi OG on the Defiant podcast to start of the year. Appreciate it. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thanks, Cami. Really appreciate you having me on.